In 1981, a Soviet mother living in a cramped communal apartment in Moscow could look at an empty pantry, a single onion, a sack of potatoes, and half a loaf of stale black bread and know exactly how to feed a family of 5 for 3 days. Women who had never thought of themselves as cooks became alchemists, turning the cheapest ingredients into something that tasted like survival, community, and home. And here is what nobody talks about. The meals those women cooked during brutal Russian winters and chronic food shortages were not just survival food, they were miracles of endurance. Number 14 on this list was born out of pure desperation, but became a nostalgic comfort food entire generations still crave. Number 7 contains a protein profile that kept factory workers standing through grueling 12-hour shifts. These 25 meals did not disappear because they were bad. They disappeared because modern convenience culture ate your grandmother's recipe box alive. Before we start, hit subscribe, because what you are about to remember might send you straight to your kitchen. Let's count down the 25 forgotten poor man meals from the Soviet era that kept families alive. Number 25, kartoshka v. mundier, jacket potatoes. Potatoes in their uniform. This was the ultimate bare minimum meal across the Soviet Union. Potatoes were cheap and could survive months in a dark root cellar. Mothers boiled them whole with the skin still on, because peeling them meant throwing away a millimeter of edible flesh. You peeled them at the table with your fingers, burning your hands, dipping the steaming yellow flesh into coarse salt, and perhaps a single drop of unrefined sunflower oil if you were lucky. It was fuel, it was fast. It was exactly what you ate when the state grocery store shelves were completely bare. Number 24, turia, bread and kvass soup. This one sounds like a punishment to modern ears, but it was a lifeline. You took stale, rock-hard black rye bread, broke it into chunks, and poured cold kvass, a fermented drink made from leftover bread, over the top. Throw in a chopped raw onion and a pinch of salt and you had supper. It required no stove, no fire, and no fresh ingredients. It was a peasant dish that survived the revolution and kept right on feeding hungry workers in concrete apartment blocks. Number 23, klebs maslom I sakarom, bread, butter, and sugar. If you grew up in a working-class Soviet household, you already know this one. A thick slice of black bread, spread with whatever fat was available, butter or often margarine, then sprinkled generously with white granulated sugar. The soft bread absorbed the fat, and the sugar dissolved just slightly at the edges where it touched the fat, becoming something almost crystalline and sweet. It was the Soviet child's birthday cake on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody wrote it down. It was just what you made when there was nothing else. Number 22, morkovny chai, carrot tea. Real black tea from India or Ceylon was a luxury that frequently disappeared from stores. So grandmothers took carrots, grated them fine, roasted them in a dry cast iron pan until they were dark and caramelized, and brewed them in boiling water. The resulting drink was dark, slightly sweet, and earthy. It warmed the hands against a tin cup in the cold dark before the work began. It tricked the brain into perceiving comfort when the reality was freezing pipes and empty cupboards. Number 21, Kysel, starch fruit drink. Too thick to be a drink, too thin to be a pudding. Kysel was made from a handful of old berries or fruit jam, boiled with water and heavily thickened with potato starch. The starch was dirt cheap and it swelled in the stomach, tricking the body into feeling completely full. Served warm in winter or cold in summer, it coated the ribs. It was bright, it was sweet, and it stretched 2 spoons of jam into dessert for an entire family. Here is where things get uncomfortable. In the Soviet Union, the concept of a deficit wasn't an emergency. It was a permanent state of being. The state planned the economy, but mothers planned the survival. There were no advertising executives telling them to buy boxed mixes. The foods that keep people alive and independent are the foods nobody can make money from. The meals on this list were born from a supply chain that constantly failed, navigated with extraordinary creativity. Number 20, zharanaya kapusta, fried cabbage. A head of white cabbage cost mere kopecks. Sliced thin and thrown into a heavy skillet with a little oil and onions, it was fried hard until the edges turned dark brown and caramelized. The natural sugars in the cabbage bloomed in the heat, turning a watery, cheap vegetable into something savory and deeply satisfying. Eaten with a piece of black bread, it was dinner for 4 nights a week in millions of homes. Number 19, shchia z kwashenoi kapusti, sour cabbage soup. Fresh vegetables vanished in October, but fermented cabbage lasted until May. Shchi was the soup of the Russian winter. A massive pot of water, a mountain of sour cabbage, an onion, and a potato. Simmered for hours on the back of the stove, the acid from the cabbage broke down the starches into a thick, tangy broth. It was applied microbiology refined across generations, keeping scurvy at bay and bellies full when fresh food was a myth. Number 18. Grechka s grybami, buckwheat and mushrooms. Buckwheat, grechka, was the king of Soviet grains. But to make it a meal, families headed into the birch forests on weekends to forage for wild mushrooms. They dried them on strings across their small kitchens. In the dead of winter, a handful of those dried mushrooms rehydrated in a pot of boiled buckwheat turned a simple side dish into a rich, earthy, deeply savory main course. Foraging wasn't a hobby, it was a necessary harvest. Number 17. Buterbrod s kolbasoy, doctor's sausage sandwich. A single paper-thin slice of processed doctor's sausage placed on a piece of buttered black bread. But here was the trick. Soviet children were taught to eat the sandwich upside down, so the sausage hit the tongue first. It maximized the flavor of the meat before the dense bread took over. It was the ultimate exercise in rationing pleasure. Number 16. Pelmeni, stretched meat dumplings. Pelmeni are famous, but the poor man's version was different. When meat was impossibly scarce, the ratio of dough to filling changed dramatically. Mothers mixed a tiny scrap of ground meat with massive amounts of grated ice, onions, and sometimes bread. The ice melted during boiling, leaving a pocket of savory broth inside a thick dumpling. You got the illusion of a meat dinner, but the flour and water were doing all the heavy lifting. The reality of the kommunalka, or communal apartment, changed how people cooked. 6 families sharing one kitchen, 4 burners, and 0 privacy. You couldn't leave a roast unattended even if you had one. These one-pot meals and quick skillet dishes were designed for speed, survival, and staying out of the neighbor's way. That arithmetic saved families. Number 15. Makaronia sakaram, macaroni with sugar. Leftover boiled pasta, cold and stiff from the fridge, was thrown into a skillet with a pat of butter, fried until the edges got slightly crispy, and then heavily dusted with white sugar. The sugar melted into the hot butter to create a quick, dirty caramel. The whole concept was designed for children, and it worked completely. It turned yesterday's bland rations into today's coveted treat. Number 14, kotlety iz chleba, bread-stretched patties. This is the trick most people have forgotten entirely. Mothers who needed to stretch a tiny ration of ground meat into dinner for 6 did it with stale black bread. They soaked the rock-hard bread in water or milk until it turned to a soft paste, then worked it thoroughly into the raw meat with grated onion. Sometimes it was 70% bread and 30% meat. The bread patted the mixture invisibly. Fried in a pan, they came out larger, softer, and more tender than pure beef. The children never knew. Number 13. Sukhariki, salted dried crusts. When a loaf of bread finally went completely stale, it was never thrown away. Nothing went to waste in a household that understood hunger. The hardened bread was cut into small cubes, tossed with salt and a few drops of oil, and baked in the oven until they were rock-hard croutons. They were eaten like popcorn, softening slowly in the mouth, occupying children's hands and jaws for hours. Number 12. Blyny navod, water pancakes. Real blyny require milk, eggs, and butter. The poor man's Soviet blini required none of those. Flour, water, a pinch of salt, and a dash of baking soda reacted to create a thin, pliable batter. Fried in a desperately thin slick of oil, they came out pale but hot. Rolled up with a smear of cheap jam, they were the difference between eating and not eating, between nutrition and decline. Number 11. Vinaigrette, root vegetable salad. Not the French dressing. The Soviet vinaigrette was a massive bowl of boiled beets, carrots, potatoes, chopped pickles, and sauerkraut, all dressed heavily in cheap, unrefined sunflower oil. It was entirely composed of ingredients that could survive a frozen cellar. The beets dyed everything a neon purple. It was crunchy, acidic, sweet, and slick with oil. It fed an army on pennies. Notice how many of these meals rely on acid? Pickles, sour milk, fermented cabbage. Food historians now point out that with almost no money and extreme restrictions on ingredients, home cooks developed a deep reliance on preservation. The acid woke up the palate and masked the cheapness of the root vegetables. They were balancing flavor profiles perfectly, driven by pure necessity. Number 10. Rasolnik, pickle brine soup. Never, ever pour the brine from a jar of pickles down the drain. That was the law. That cloudy, salty, garlic-heavy liquid became the foundation of rasolnik. Boiled with pearl barley, potatoes, and whatever tiny scraps of offal or meat could be found, the pickle brine seasoned the entire pot. The barley swelled and thickened the soup, while the acid made the broth taste impossibly rich. Number 9. Seledka pod shuboy, herring under a fur coat. A holiday dish born of severe limitation. Salted herring was cheap and pungent. To make it feed a table of 10, it was chopped fine and buried under massive, towering layers of grated boiled potatoes, carrots, beets, and mayonnaise. The fur coat of cheap root vegetables stretched the fish flavor through the entire casserole. It looked like a pink cake. It tasted like a celebration. Number 8. Macaroni po-flotsky, Navy-style macaroni. A block of cheap Soviet pasta, boiled to death, drained and mixed vigorously with a single can of tushenka, military-style stewed meat. The gelatinous fat from the canned meat melted over the hot pasta, coating every noodle in a deeply savory, salty glaze. It was purely caloric, heavy, and universally loved. Men who worked on the shipyards ate this and showed up the next day without complaint. Number 7. Kolodets, meat jelly. This one separates the squeamish from the practical. Pig trotters, ears, and soup bones, the cuts the butcher practically gave away, were boiled for 8 to 10 hours. The natural collagen broke down, and the broth was poured over whatever tiny shreds of meat fell off the bone, then left in the cold winter windowsill to set. By morning, it was a dense, sliceable meat jelly. Eaten with fiery mustard or horseradish, it provided massive amounts of protein and fat. Number 6. Salo s chesnakom, cured pork fat with garlic. Pure, unadulterated cured pork fatback. Sliced so thin you could read a newspaper through it, placed on a piece of black bread, and rubbed with a raw clove of garlic. Modern dieters would panic. Soviet laborers knew that a single slice of salo provided the slow-burning calories needed to survive waiting for a bus in -20 degrees. Hunger is the greatest seasoning and pride is expensive. Number 5. Tvorog iz kislego moloka, sour milk curds. When milk went sour, you didn't throw it out. You put it in a pot on low heat until the curds separated from the whey. You strained it through a piece of cheesecloth hung over the kitchen sink. What was left was tvorog, a dense, tangy, dry cottage cheese. Mixed with a spoonful of sugar, it was a protein-packed breakfast made from something that a modern American would have poured down the drain. Number 4. Zharenaya kartoshka s lukom, fried potatoes with onions. A massive cast-iron skillet filled to the brim with rough-cut potatoes and yellow onions, fried in heavy oil until the bottom crusted over into a dark, salty mat. You didn't stir it too much. The crust was the entire point. Served in the middle of the table, everyone ate straight from the pan. It smelled of caramelizing onion and roasting starch. It cost absolutely nothing, and it silenced a room. Number 3. Kompot iz sukofruktov, dried fruit stew. In the brief summer months, Soviet families gathered apples, pears, and berries, laying them out on newspapers to dry in the sun until they looked like leather. In December, those rock-hard fruits were thrown into a pot of boiling water. The resulting dark, sweet liquid was kompot. The fruit itself turned soft and spongy, acting as both a drink and a dessert. It was the taste of summer preserved for the darkest days of winter. Number 2. Kasha iz topora, axe porridge, scrap stew. Named after an old Russian folktale where a soldier tricks a greedy woman into making soup from an axe by slowly asking for just a pinch of salt, a single grain, a lonely potato to flavor the axe. In reality, this was the Soviet clean-out-the-pantry stew. A heel of bread, a lonely carrot, a handful of millet, a bone with no meat, cooked together until it formed a thick, anonymous porridge. The smell of it cooking, that vague, savory steam that could have been anything, was the smell of not giving up. Number 1. Golyi borscht, naked borscht. The greatest one-pot meal of the Soviet era was naked, borscht without a single ounce of meat or bone broth. It was just water, beets, cabbage, potatoes, and a splash of vinegar to keep the beets red. Cooked low and slow, the vegetables surrendered everything they had to the water. It was thin, but it was hot, and it was served with a fierce pride. It was not a recipe, it was a declaration. It meant that whoever was standing at that stove had managed, at least for tonight, to keep the family fed. The mathematics of hunger and gratitude always worked out over a bowl of hot borscht. These 25 meals were not desperate tragedies. They were brilliant, deeply human answers to the question of how to feed people well when you had almost nothing. Genius does not require expensive ingredients. It requires necessity, attention, and the refusal to waste anything. The families who survived the Soviet era were sustained by the simple human understanding that a good meal shared around a table is not a small thing. Tell me in the comments, have you ever tried making water bliny or stretching a meal with stale bread? Did your grandparents tell you stories of how they survived the hard times? Share your memories below and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because that knowledge belongs to all of us.